Thank you, thank you, Steve. And thanks for coming, Joshua. I'm looking forward to this. I've covered media a long time, and there have always been issues of brand safety. I'd like to start off by asking, why is now the time for an actually dedicated role and even a bureau for the industry to tackle it?
That's a fair and good question. So yes, brand safety has always been a challenge and an issue in the industry. I think where it's become more pronounced is digital. The complexity of the way digital media is delivered, I'll say seemingly randomness of the way ads can appear almost anywhere, raises questions about, are you appearing in the right environment or on the right property? I think the other thing that's really changed in the media landscape is the democratization of publishing. So once upon a time, there were a lot more barriers to publishing, which created barriers to receiving advertising revenue. And digital's opened all these, like anyone now can create a website and start taking ads, which opens a lot more opportunity for advertisers and brands to be exposed to unsafe environments.
Okay, so basically the landscape's changing, technology is a big driver, but is it that the media experience is different, the content experience is different? Which is the biggest challenge to you in terms of understanding the safety of the environment? Is it the content, the media experience? Users have more control. They're not necessarily just looking at your commercial adjacent to a piece of content. They might be doing all kinds of things around it.
I think it's the content experience that's a major challenge, and the reason why is, I'll get back to, one of the sort of the fundamental problems or challenges that digital media has is there's this expectation that every impression deserves to have an ad against it. So every piece of content, there's this expectation that's an opportunity to serve an ad, and there's technology infrastructure in place to actually serve an ad. And that should not be the case. There should be decisions made about the right environment, the right context, and every impression shouldn't be a place to monetize content.
So is that from a publisher's point of view, from an advertiser's point of view, or from a consumer's point of view?
I think it's from everyone's point of view. The US is interesting because, we always talk about the right to freedom of speech, and content providers and anyone should publish whatever content they want. I think there needs to be a separation of responsibility about the right to monetization, and there's a right to free speech, there's not a right to monetization. And I mean, we're starting to do research now, we're going to release a study shortly, and there's clearly a consumer expectation that brands shouldn't be associated or next to environments that are not in line with consumer values, not in line with brand values, and not in line with what's for the best interest for society. And one of the things I always talk about is, it's not that, in my role, I'm not trying to be the moral police of the internet. We talk about brand safety, and brand safety is, ads shouldn't appear next to terrorism content or violent extremism or hate speech, all of those sorts of things. And that's things that have got negative consequences for the entire society. Then there's what I would call brand sensitivity, and those are things which is what a brand feels comfortable about being around. So certain advertisers might not like to be around. The easiest example that everyone gives is historically, airlines have never wanted to be around ads that involve airline disasters, and that goes true for traditional media or digital media. And that's a brand sensitivity issue. It doesn't actually do irreparable damage to the brand to be in those sorts of environments. It's just something that being sensitive towards the topic or what's right for your brand, you don't want to be in. And what we've got to help brands navigate is that spectrum between two things. And what digital's really opened up is there's a lot more opportunity for the violent extremism and the inappropriate content that's full of hate and intolerance and all those things that represent the darker side of humanity. And every time an ad appears next to that, you end up with these two questions, which is, one, do I want my brand associated with negative hate speech? And then the second one, and this gets back to the democratization of publishing, is by advertising on that content, am I inadvertently funding hate speech? Because, and the example I always give, and I know I'm talking a lot, but if you take something like an ISIS video, and there's not a single advertiser out there that wants to appear next to an ISIS video. If CNN is doing a story about ISIS, and there's an ad on that page on the site, that's a brand sensitivity issue and a brand safety issue. You don't want to be there. If there's an ISIS video on an online video site where part of that advertising revenue goes back and funds ISIS, that's the thing that becomes reprehensible and has no place in the industry.
Okay, so there's two fundamental buckets here. One is something that's endemic to that brand, a sensitivity issue, and the other is almost like an industry ethical issue, which is, are you underwriting or subsidizing bad stuff? So are we going to see something like guidelines or standards evolve, like possibly through the Bureau or some of your work?
Yeah, so, I mean, the APB, and I'll just talk about that for a second, because the Advertiser Protection Bureau, which operates through the 4As, came about because I was at a 4As meeting, I was talking about brand safety, and every time there's a brand safety incident that I observe, it's never just one of my clients. Like if you see something, an ad in an inappropriate spot, you hit refresh 100 times, you'll see 100 different advertisers, 99 of which won't be your clients, and there's no joy in seeing that. You don't go, ah, ha, ha. You're like, this is terrible, and it undermines confidence in the industry. So the APB is every major agency holding group now has a brand safety liaison. We talk every Friday. We have an alert system, so if we see something, we say something and share it with everyone. So it's that centralized intelligence side of things. And one of the things we're working on is like a shared, what we call like an advertiser bill of rights. So a shared way for all of us to go, these are things that advertisers believe in, these are the things that agencies believe in, these are the places where we don't want ads to run. All advertisers agree, all agencies agree, because we need to stop the sensationalism of brand safety incidents. We all agree ads shouldn't run in inappropriate spots. The only alternative to ensuring that ads never run in inappropriate spots is to either stop advertising in digital or advertise in really super safe, innocuous content. So we'd all be on recipe sites. We'd never fund news because news sites in and of themselves are unpredictable and unsafe. And one thing that I personally fundamentally believe in is the quality and importance of quality journalism. And so we can't afford not to fund news, like quality news. So what we've got to accept is we've got to push for better standards. We've got to accept that we don't want to be in these places, that we'll put all the safety guards rails in that we can. If something happens, we will immediately take those ads down, but we're not going to run around and scream and go, I'm never going to advertise again, or I'm going to suspend all my spend. And the analogy I always use is, most people drive a car. If you drive a car, you accept that one of the risks of driving a car is you might have an accident in your lifetime. Might be a small accident, might be a major accident, but when you have an accident, you don't then sell your car, lock yourself in the house and go, I'm never going out on the road again because roads are dangerous. You accept that that's the cost of being able to go anywhere you want at will. And consumers are consuming digital platforms. There's a risk associated with that. You have to accept that there's a risk. You can do everything you can to mitigate the risk, but when something goes wrong, you have to have mature and reasonable responses to dealing with that, and publicly go on record that go, I don't want to be in those bad environments, so when things happen, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again and try and get better.
So what is the goal of the Bureau then, to just be a community that shares information about these things, or is the goal to somehow standardize that and come up with guidelines?
One is the centralized intelligence capability, and the focus of this summit is OTT. One of the challenges that we have is when an incident occurs and I talk to a media partner, they'll come and tell me a number and they'll go, oh, look, the impact on you was really minor. It was 3 ads. It was 42 cents. You don't need to worry. And you go, well, how big was it with everyone else? And they go, oh, I can't share everyone else's data because, they're your competitors. So the APB allows us to all sit in a room and go, well, I was told this, you were told that. Okay, it's a much bigger problem than we saw. The goal is not really to create new standards because you've got the IAB, you've got the MRC. They're really the industry standard bodies, and God help us, like the last thing we all need is another industry body coming up with a whole bunch of other standards that no one's going to adhere to. If we can drive better accountability of partners to adhering to existing standards, better transparency about when incidents occur, and ensuring that standards actually represent, like the MRC represents publishers and not necessarily advertisers. If we can be a voice for advertisers in the industry, I think that's the important role that we can play.
Okay. So let's just follow up on the MRC. They have been setting standards, things like viewability and other things that have, for better or worse, become guideposts for the industry. They are starting to tackle brand safety. I know it's early stages, but so is that the self-regulatory body that will establish the baseline, and then everybody will operate around that? Is that kind of how it would evolve?
The vision is that MRC would set the standards, and they would become the baseline. And again, I get back to, I'm trying to balance that need for the brand safety versus brand sensitivity and set standards around what protects society as opposed to what, I don't want to take this position of moral police or censorship. So it's the hate speech, the racism, the extremist content, those are the sorts of things that we need to set rules around how we define and ensure brands are protected from.
So focusing on that, there's an economic component here, which is that in some way or other, advertising plays an important role in underwriting media and media content. And if you make it uneconomically viable for these unsavory sources to publish, then they will go away.
I mean, that's the hope, and that's where I get back to the monetization question, and that's where I would even say things like GDPR actually become a benefit to the industry, because if you're much more strict around how data can be used, it becomes a disincentive to like faking traffic or pretending that these users actually exist on hate sites.
So is it going to be a never-ending battle? I just was reading today that there's a new scam that's basically distributing code to create invalid traffic to generate energy to power a new cryptocurrency. Yeah. You've heard about
Yeah,
this.
I've heard about this.
I mean, there's always some new scam or some way of leveraging technology to create human activity that generates money, right? Mm-hmm. So is it a constant arms race that we have to be vigilant against?
I think the best and worst part about my job is, the worst part is it'll never go away. The best part is I'm never going to be out of a job. And I'd much rather be out of a job. It'll be a constant arms race, and we sort of pivot and sort of talk about OTT. The challenge is when anybody's ever incentivized to perform badly and can make money from it, people are going to find a way to perform badly and make money for it. That's why fraud exists everywhere. That's why you've got challenges everywhere. And like the biggest thing that's been going for the OTT environment at the moment is there was very little incentive to like go and buy, 10,000 TVs, put them in a warehouse somewhere and start streaming content, because all the people streaming on OTT were all the legitimate operators who there's no incentive to like jack up their numbers. It gets back to the ease of opening up the publishing framework and the distribution platform. So now that you don't need to own cable infrastructure or satellites in the sky or install satellite dishes, and anyone can foreseeably become an OTT content provider, that opens the door to brand safety issues in the OTT environment, because I can be a producer of inappropriate content, I can now create my own OTT channel, I can make it available to anyone in the world because now I can have scale because I have a global audience, I can make that inventory available programmatically, and that then opens even more floodgates to like, okay, it's now open for brands to be in there even though they don't know they're going to be in there. And if I've now got my, standalone, independent hate speech OTT channel, why not start generating fake traffic on it to obtain more ad revenue? And that's, you can go on the web now, there's websites, like the terrible thing right now is you can go on the web now and buy fake Instagram followers, YouTube views, likes on Facebook, Twitter retweets. It won't be long in this arms race where someone goes, oh, now I can generate fake OTT channel, subscribers. We've got to be vigilant about, weeding these content out. And really, I get back to this, making a decision that every channel is not open to monetization. Just because there's an audience doesn't mean it deserves advertising revenue.
Yeah, so now are you speaking primarily for the elite 4As, A&A, Fortune 1000 type brands? Because there's a long tail out there. Yeah. We had a presentation earlier today from a direct-to-consumer brand, Purple Mattress, that primarily uses YouTube to market itself and uses a lot of, you know, humor, but, you know, things that maybe your brands might find inappropriate. So isn't there room in the world for a real diverse array of brands using different forms of content?
I mean, that gets back to sort of the brand sensitivity debate. And one of the, you know, I know Spotify, who's one of our clients, is a sponsor, and that's a perfect example. They've got Rap Caviar, which is a channel that you can listen to. There are some brands that would be all over rap music, and there's some brands that won't. Not looking to silence, you know, that genre of music. There's absolutely room for different opinions and everything else. You have to accept that not every brand is going to be there, and it's not about brands exercising censorship. Brands have finite budgets. They make decisions every day where and where they won't advertise. And by not advertising in a channel doesn't mean you're necessarily censoring that point of view. You're making the same budget decision you make every day. Like, I'd love it if all my clients had infinite budgets and I could advertise everywhere. I don't. If every publisher came and complained to me because they're like, hey, you're not here, you're trying to censor me, that's not true. I've got a finite budget, I make a decision. Either your audience is not a fit, or your content's not a fit, or I'm going to get scale somewhere else.
All right, so let me flip this over to your other role, which is Chief Innovation Officer. Is there an innovator's dilemma here in the sense that you may not be doing these things, but there are a lot of new startup brands out there that are going to embrace them, lean in, and win audiences and reach? I mean, some of it will be invalid traffic, but a lot of it's going to eat market share too. So what's the challenge of you walking those two roles of being daring, taking risks, being innovative, versus being safe, secure, and brand safe?
I really do have the innovator's dilemma because I sit on both sides, and I always joke that part of me is the digital innovation person, which is, hey, spend more money on digital, you really need to be there. And then the other part of me is like, oh, be really careful, it's quite a dangerous place. The way I sort of trade that off is on the digital side, a lot of the long tail side is actually driven by pricing efficiency. So if you're a new and emerging brand or a category, you can't afford to be often in those premium type environments, and therefore you take a risk. And for the Fortune 1000 clients, we get in this unfortunate debate every time we pitch and win a new account, which is they want pricing efficiency, and pricing efficiency entails risk, and therefore risk can expose you to brand safety incidents, and then you'll want to come and complain to your agency about being in unsafe environments. And I'm like, well, hey, wait a minute, you ask for cheaper inventory, you can't have both, they're mutually exclusive. If you're a new and emerging brand, I absolutely get those trade-offs, and I'd get back to brand sensitivity and brand safety, which is you can be in the longer tail of the internet. You don't need to be in front of extremist videos, and I'm yet to see a hate-driven, extremist, intolerant organisation ever come out and go, thank goodness this brand is advertising on us and supporting us. And all I've ever seen is consumers complaining and going, this does not represent your brand, I'm not going to engage with your brand because you're on these sites. Okay,
at some point some of that starts to go, I mean, there's obvious unsavory positions, but some of it becomes political.
Yeah.
And I know big major brands by definition don't want to be political, although the last 2 years have shown like there's leaning in and leaning out. What are the guide rails for that in terms of brand content safety? Is it something that can be standardized and managed?
I don't think it can be standardized by the industry. It has to be, I mean, we've got a diagnostic tool that we work through with clients to help them understand where they sit in the spectrum and how they are going to respond, because a lot of it is, all brands have values, and a brand that doesn't have a value or a purpose really has no place in marketing in this modern age. What we help brands understand is how they're going to respond to those incidents, because you can't take a backseat to political conversation and discourse, and brands and advertising have an important role in moving society forward. What you need to understand as an organisation is how you're going to respond if you're in one of, like, I'm trying to think of one that's sort of like a non-super hyper controversial. One, let's take something like healthcare. Healthcare is one of those sort of problematic categories which can get highly politicized and people have very differing opinions around. And you can make a decision as a brand is like, I'm going to be part of that debate, and if I'm going to be part of that debate or around certain content that advocates one position or another, and then consumers start reacting negatively towards me and advocating a boycott of my brand or destroying my products or something like that, how am I going to respond when things go bad? And that becomes much more of an exercise in crisis management and PR management than how to deal with media and advertising. And a lot of the conversations that have been absent today in brand safety is the conversation with the crisis management, the PR, the corp comms team of, okay, something's gone wrong, how do we as a brand respond so that we're like, hey, we made this decision for this reason, these represent our values, accept it, this is who we are, or don't deal with us. And I don't think a lot of brands have actually sat down and formalized those sorts of conversations internally.
Okay. I think we have some time for some audience questions if anybody wants to get an early look at some brand safety issues. So one of the things I'm wondering about is the speed of change that's impacted our industry and how it's impacting all media, not just new media. So when we started out with TV, Ricky and Lucy couldn't have a single bed in their bedroom because it was too controversial. So it's constantly pushing the edge. Cable TV changed the standards and practices for broadcast. OTT and all these vertical channels are probably going to put pressure on society changing its norms. Do you worry at some point our ethical standards as a society will change because there's so much diversity and choice out there?
I mean, and this will sound self-serving because I work in the advertising industry, my bigger concern is the increasing trend and shift of consumers to ad-free environments. So you look at the growth of, Netflix, you look at the stats for Hulu, and it was like there was a public comment made a couple of weeks ago at the Code conference that 40% of Hulu subscribers pay for an ad-free product. You look at brands like Spotify, which have an ad-free subscription offering. And I'm less concerned about societal norms and standards changing. It's that increasingly consumers will shift to ad-free environments. And I worry about how brands start getting their message out to consumers when there's more ad-free environments. And that's where, on the brand safety scale, I always go, we've got to have this balanced response and stop sensationalizing the issue, is if we keep pulling back from digital advertising, we will push publishers and media owners more to subscription content offerings. And to make those work, the expectation with consumers is if I'm paying a subscription, I want it to be ad-free. And that will necessarily mean less opportunities for brands to tell their stories.
We have a question in back.
Hi, I'm Brooke with Omnicom. You mentioned that people are going to fraud, whenever they can, and one of my biggest fears is fraud when it comes to OTT, specifically on connected devices. What are you guys doing to validate a lot of that inventory, since most of the third-party, brand safety partners aren't there yet?
So the question, I'm just going to repeat it back, is what are we doing to protect and against fraud in the OTT environment, especially given third-party verification companies don't have a solution there yet? There's two things we're doing. One is, we're really pushing a lot of the device manufacturers in terms of accountability and what they can provide in measurement and standards, and understanding, one of the big challenges, and it's the same challenge that's existed with cable, which is if the device is on standby, therefore the screen is off, but the device is still connected and streaming to the internet, are we getting those views counted? And a lot of the hardware manufacturers are actually building automated timeouts in their platforms, as well as the streaming, subscription streaming providers, because they have to pay license fees for streaming content, whether someone's watching or not. So they're incentivized to turn off access. The other one is we're aggressively pushing the third-party verification companies. The big thing is we need to open up the platforms, and the biggest challenge we have is we're still, what I'd say is 25, 30 years ago in the operating system environment, which is you've got too much fragmentation in the operating systems, which means it's hard to get standardization in development. You've got then different user experiences. You can like install an OTT platform on Roku, Android TV, Samsung, Fire TV, and have a completely different user experience. So we need standardization of the operating environments, and that's only going to come through over time. There's limits to what we can do for that, but we've got to keep pushing these device makers to actually timeouts, allow third-party verification, and demand, like, I don't think we can like turn off spend, which is like the ultimate penalty, but demand that they treat this seriously, because I don't want the challenges that have hit traditional digital media to hit the OTT environment.
I wanted to drill a little bit into Joe's question about partisanship, because partisanship seems to have narrowed our idea of the range, or narrowed the range of acceptable content in many people's minds. And you mentioned that you're sort of going through diagnostics with brands about where their sensitivities lie. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing from a lot of brands about how they're looking at the terrain of particularly, say, news content, which can be construed as questionable by different audiences now in ways that maybe they weren't even 2 or 3 years ago?
So the news content one is, like, it's interesting and challenging in so many ways, and in my global role, becoming aware of nuances in each market, and just to sort of make sure everyone heard the question, it's about, how we deal with brand safety in the news environment. Within the US, a lot of the focus has been on eliminating exposure to fake news or questionable news sources or unverified news, because it's very easy to start a site and pretend and look like a legitimate news organization and just publish any nonsense you want. So we're working, there's Harvard, MIT, there's a whole bunch of news organizations as well that are creating, or news lobbyist organizations are creating platforms where you can actually verify the editorial independence of a source and make sure it's legitimate. I'm not going to mention the name of it now because I don't like giving fake news sources airtime or branding, but there's certain markets in America that no longer have a local newspaper, which to me is personally horrifying. And then you've seen digital publications spring up that sound like they're from the local area and they're purely fake news providers. So we're doing a lot of work on identifying and eliminating those. On the fake news side of things and sort of separating out partisanship and opinion, the bit that becomes really, really interesting is how different brands react to that. We've got, in the UK, one of our clients is The Economist, so it's a news organisation. It's really diligent about making sure it doesn't appear in fake news or questionable environments. We use a third-party provider that has an AI platform that can identify sentiment in news and can identify whether it's opinion or polarizing, because you take a controversial topic like gun rights or the Second Amendment, you can provide a clear, balanced thing, or you can actually push a political point of view. And we use AI tools to understand, is someone writing an informed editorial piece about it, or are they trying to push an opinion? Because we're all okay with an informed editorial piece. If someone's trying to advocate a position, we might not want to be there. Quite frankly, it's a consistent, real challenge, and it's hard to protect in real time. And when we talk to brands about it, it becomes highly nuanced around particular topics. So it's not the broad, we don't want to be in fake news. We don't want to be in news content around these certain topics. And it's not necessarily the ones that you would immediately suspect. So it's not always health, abortion, gun control, reproductive rights. It could be about things like, if you're a finance organisation, it's certain types of financial news you don't want to be around, because there's a whole bunch of, I'll call them fake news sites that just try and pump and dump stocks. And that's the fake news challenge we're trying to solve for certain organisations. So it's very highly nuanced.
I wanted to go back to something you had said earlier on. I got the impression that you were averse to this idea of brands sort of declaring that they're pulling their money from a platform or a channel because of a bad incident. It seems to me that's exactly what we need brands to do more of if the Facebooks and the Googles, actually there are only 2 Facebooks and Googles, are really going to wake up and put some human resources against this problem.
Sort of to clarify on that, I'm not opposed to brands pulling spend as a way of advocating for change or, you know, the adoption of third-party verification. What I'm against is brands doing that without thinking it through and having a dialogue and pulling spend from digital across the board. And that's, unfortunately, it's the pulling the spend everywhere across the board, which is their reaction. And it's not having a dialogue with publishers and also not understanding the limits of what we can provide protection against. And you get back, and we'll talk about, like we haven't talked about the elephant in the room, which is YouTube, which went through a whole lot of challenges a year ago around brand safety. And part of that was the absence of third-party verification, which was coming to the platform, and rightly so. But the bigger challenge there was the monetization thresholds, which was you could put a video up and within an hour you'd be eligible for ads no matter how many people had seen your video. And pulling your ads, for brands to pull their ads from YouTube to sort of go, you need to do something about it, when the conversation needs to be, hey, YouTube, introduce content monetization thresholds, and hey, it's not just YouTube, it's every website. Like, wait till you've had the page and 100, 10,000, 1,000 views of it, because we need some time for the third-party verification technology to crawl the content, understand it, diagnose whether it's safe, and then make a decision. And that gets back to, the historical comment you made, which is back in, in air quotes, the golden age of television, advertising agencies used to get copies of TV scripts so that you could make a decision whether a brand was going to be in there or not. And in the real-time nature of digital, we don't have that luxury anymore. So we need these content monetization thresholds, which is, it's humanly impossible for me to review every page out there on the internet, but at least give me a couple of minutes, give me 15 minutes, half an hour for the bots to crawl the page, for us to audit the content, to do the sentiment analysis, to understand whether it's a safe environment. Don't expect an ad on there as soon as you publish.
Can I ask one wrap-up question?
Yeah.
So we're on the cusp of a whole new age of screens with IoT and AR and VR, where it could literally be infinite, and the most important screen is the one behind our eyeglasses.
Mm-hmm.
What are the unintended consequences we need to be planning for now to deal with this infinite proliferation of screen experiences from a brand safety point of view?
I think the thing that we need to be thinking about now and preparing for, and we're heading to a world of infinite media and infinite availability of media impressions. There's no constraint on supply anymore. What we need to be really thinking about is the value of people and audiences, because the population is not going to be infinite. Your consumer is, the addressable consumer audience that you need to hit is not going to be infinite. So thinking more about, and we know from all the media research throughout history that there's wear out. So the more I expose you to the brand, it's just diminishing returns, and then it will make you hate my brand. So we need to be having the hard, serious conversations now about optimal, I've got an audience that I need to reach. How many times do I need to reach them? And once that audience is exposed, and this is a question for both brands and publishers, do I turn off advertising? And one of the wrap-up statement I'll make, one of my best clients that I have is the United States Postal Service. And one of the United States Postal Service's goals is to have less junk mail. And the reason why their goal is to have less junk mail is because too much junk mail makes the value of direct mail diminish. And what I worry about is, in a world of infinite impressions, we'll end up in a world of junk advertising. And we need to start thinking about how do we start pulling back, trying to serve less advertising because it provides a better consumer experience or make advertising more effective. And we won't end up in this world where digital is just full of junk advertising, which is not respected.
Well, thankfully, thanks to the GDPR in Europe, we're now getting 40% less junk mail in our inboxes. So there is hope.
There is.
Joe and Joshua, thank you very much. That was great. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua.